She was left for dead, but she came back stronger. Eleanor Carter loved him, trusted him, carried his child. But Sebastian Graves, the man she gave everything to, betrayed her in the cruelest way, by leaving her to die. Alone, pregnant, and abandoned in the wilderness, Ellie fought to survive, and when she did, she had only one goal. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories. You won't want to miss what happens next. The golden chandeliers cast a warm glow over the grand hall, their light dancing across the polished marble floors and the sea of well-dressed guests. This was the wedding of the year. Sebastian Graves, one of the most powerful billionaires in the country, was about to marry Lillian Vaughn, heiress to an empire of wealth and influence. Every seat in the hall was filled with those who mattered. Business moguls, politicians, celebrities, all gathered to witness the perfect union of power and prestige. The air was thick with the scent of roses and champagne, and the murmurs of admiration floated through the air like a symphony of wealth. Outside, beyond the towering doors that separated her from the man who had once sworn his love, Eleanor Ellie Carter stood frozen in the cold. The borrowed coat she wore did little to shield her from the biting wind, her trembling fingers tightening over the fabric as she forced herself to breathe. Every inch of her body screamed for her to turn back, to run before she shattered completely, but the soft ripple of movement beneath her palm, her unborn child, grounded her. She wasn't here for herself. She was here for them. Sebastian had left her to die. She hadn't. The reflection staring back at her from the grand entrance's glass panels was barely recognizable. Hollow cheeks, lips cracked from dehydration, dark circles carved deep under her burning eyes. She looked like a ghost, a woman resurrected from the grave, and in a way she was. She had spent months trapped in darkness, in agony, abandoned to the wilderness with nothing but sheer will keeping her alive. He had stolen everything from her, her trust, her future, her life. But not this. Not her child. Not her justice. Her breath hitched as she reached for the door handle, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. Every ounce of strength left in her body poured into that motion as she shoved the heavy doors open. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The music screeched to a halt. 100 pairs of eyes snapped toward her in disbelief, confusion, and horror. The officiant, mid-sentence, faltered, his mouth parting in shock. Elegant women clutched their pearls. Men turned in their seats, whispers spreading like wildfire. And then, Sebastian, standing at the altar, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his hands resting lightly on Lillian's waist, poised to seal his union with the woman he had chosen over Ellie. The moment his gaze met hers, the color drained from his face. His entire body went rigid, fingers twitching at his sides as if he were seeing an apparition. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. No, this wasn't possible. She was supposed to be gone. She was supposed to be nothing but a distant memory, a mistake erased from his past. He had ensured it. The guests began murmuring louder. "Who is that? Is she pregnant? What's going on?" Lillian turned to Sebastian, confusion flashing in her perfect features. "Sebastian?" she whispered. But he didn't answer, because Ellie was walking toward him now, her steps slow but unwavering, her presence slicing through the suffocating silence like a blade. The train of Lillian's designer gown trailed behind her, but at this moment, she may as well have been invisible. Because the only woman in the room who mattered was the one who had just walked in from the dead. The slap cracked through the air like a gunshot. Gasps erupted. Someone let out a sharp cry. A champagne flute slipped from a trembling hand, shattering against the marble floor. Sebastian's head snapped to the side, the sheer force of the impact leaving an angry red bloom across his sharp cheekbone. He staggered slightly, blinking as if trying to comprehend what had just happened. Ellie's palm still burned from the contact, but she didn't care. She tilted her chin up, eyes locked onto his, unflinching. "Miss me, darling," she whispered, venom dripping from every syllable. A ripple of shocked murmurs swept through the room. Lillian took a step back, her elegant composure cracking. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, her voice sharp, demanding answers. Sebastian finally turned to her, his jaw tightening. "Lillian, I can explain." Ellie let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, you can explain?" She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers wrapping around the neatly folded stack of papers she had spent weeks collecting. With one swift motion, she flung them onto the altar. Medical reports, signed testimonies, a DNA test, evidence. The papers fluttered through the air before scattering at Sebastian's feet, his name printed across them in bold ink, damning and undeniable. "Tell them, Sebastian," Ellie continued, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Tell them where I was for the past 3 months. Tell them why you left me, pregnant and alone, in the middle of nowhere." Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Sebastian's chest rose and fell rapidly, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, piece by piece, and he had nowhere to run. Lillian's face twisted with realization. She bent down, snatching one of the papers from the floor, scanning the words in growing horror. "You—" Her voice cracked, her hands shaking as she turned back to him. "You told me you were never married?" Sebastian reached for her, his voice low, controlled despite the panic flickering in his eyes. "Lillian, I swear, it's not what it looks like." With a disgusted scoff, she ripped the massive diamond ring from her finger and hurled it at his chest. "We're done." The ring hit the ground with a hollow clink. The room erupted into chaos. Business partners who had once clinked glasses with Sebastian turned away, whispering among themselves. Some pulled out their phones, sending quiet, urgent messages. A few guests had already slipped toward the exit, eager to distance themselves from a sinking ship. From the front row, a figure slowly stood. Sebastian's mother. Her face was unreadable, but her voice carried the weight of finality. "You are no son of mine." Sebastian's breath hitched. "Mother, please." But she was already walking away. Security stepped forward. The venue manager, who just moments ago had been bending over backward to ensure Sebastian's every whim was met, now looked at him with barely concealed contempt. "Mr. Graves," the man said, voice clipped, "we're going to have to ask you to leave." Sebastian's breathing turned shallow. His empire, his fortune, his carefully curated image, all of it was crumbling right in front of him. And Ellie? She simply stood there, watching. Not with satisfaction, not with triumph. Just quiet, unwavering strength. Sebastian did the only thing left he could do. He turned and fled. The cafe smelled like freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon, the kind of warmth that made the cold city streets outside feel like a distant world. "Eleanor Ellie," Carter wiped down the counter, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she glanced at the clock. Another long shift. The tips had been mediocre, the customers forgettable. All except one. He sat at the same table every evening, positioned near the window where the neon city lights cast shifting patterns across the polished wood. Always dressed in sharp suits, always with a cup of black coffee, untouched until it went cold. He was a quiet observer, a presence she had grown used to, though she had never given him more than a passing glance. Sebastian Graves. She had no idea who he really was back then. The first time he spoke to her, it was barely anything, a casual remark, one she had almost brushed off entirely. "You always take the longest shifts, don't you?" Ellie barely looked up, dropping a damp rag into the bucket behind the counter. "That's called having a job," she said flatly, reaching for another glass to clean. "You should try it sometime." A slow smirk tugged at his lips, the kind of smirk that should have sent up alarms but only mildly irritated her. "Maybe I will." She ignored him. She had no patience for flirtatious, well-dressed men who thought their charm could undo years of exhaustion. But he kept coming back. Night after night, same table, same untouched coffee, same quiet gaze following her movements. For weeks he never pushed, never flirted the way most men did. He simply existed in her space, leaving impossibly generous tips without a word. He would make small observations, nothing invasive. He learned things about her without her realizing. How she always added a sprinkle of cinnamon to her coffee, how she tucked an extra pencil behind her ear, how her fingers absent-mindedly sketched designs on napkins when she thought no one was looking. "You draw, don't you?" he asked one evening, his voice cutting through the soft jazz humming from the speakers. Ellie hesitated, caught off guard. She looked down at the napkin beneath her fingers, the faint outline of a sketch she hadn't even realized she was making. "What makes you say that?" He tapped his fingers against the counter. "I've seen you doodling when you think no one's looking." Heat rushed to her face. She quickly crumpled the napkin, tossing it aside. "That doesn't mean I'm any good." Sebastian tilted his head, studying her with that unreadable expression of his. "You ever think about doing it professionally?" A dry laugh slipped from her lips. "Yeah, and I also think about winning the lottery. Doesn't mean it'll happen." His gaze lingered, dark and contemplative. "You should believe in yourself more." She scoffed, shaking her head. "You don't even know me." "Maybe not," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "But I know what it's like to want something so badly and think you'll never have it." His words unsettled her, not because they were intrusive, but because they felt real. That night, as she locked up the cafe and walked home through the biting wind, she found herself thinking about him. She didn't know when it started, when her eyes began seeking him out before she even realized what she was doing, when the sound of his voice became something familiar, something grounding. He was just a customer, she told herself, just a stranger. But he wasn't just a stranger. Sebastian Graves was a man who existed on the fringes of her life, slipping into her routine so effortlessly that she barely noticed how much she had started to expect him. He never spoke about himself, never flaunted wealth or power. And yet, something about him set off a quiet warning in the back of her mind. Maybe it was the way he watched her, not with hunger or arrogance, but with curiosity, like she was a puzzle he was trying to figure out. Maybe it was the way he left the biggest tips on the nights she was too tired to argue about it. Maybe it was the way he never made a move, not until he did. One evening, just before closing, Ellie found herself wiping down the counter, exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin. Sebastian was still there, still watching. "You ever take a break?" His voice broke the quiet. She huffed a laugh, shaking her head. Breaks are for people who can afford them. Something flickered in his expression, something almost unreadable. What if I told you that you could afford one tonight? Ellie frowned. What? Sebastian pulled a set of keys from his pocket, dangling them lazily. I'm kidnapping you for an hour. She snorted. You realize that's the worst way to phrase that. He grinned, but there was something different about it this time. Probably. She should have said no. There was no reason to leave with him, no reason to trust him. But before she could talk herself out of it, she turned toward the back room, grabbed her coat, and called to her coworker, I'll be back. Sebastian held the door open for her without a word, guiding her toward a sleek black car parked just outside. The city stretched around them as he drove, the neon glow fading into the distance. Ellie sat in silence, watching the streets melt away, the radio humming softly in the background. Where are we going? She finally asked. Sebastian glanced at her, a smirk tugging at his lips. You'll see. They drove for nearly 30 minutes, the bright lights of the city disappearing behind them, replaced by quieter roads and the soft glow of the waterfront. Sebastian stepped out first, moving around to open her door. You do realize I have work in the morning, she teased. He shrugged. 1 hour won't kill you. He led her toward a small dock where the wooden planks creaked beneath their steps. The air smelled of salt and something crisp and clean. I used to come here a lot, he said after a moment, leaning against the railing. Before work took over my life. Ellie studied him, realizing she knew so little about him. What changed? She asked. Sebastian exhaled, a small, knowing smile on his lips. She didn't press further. Instead, she let the silence settle between them, let the moment stretch without the need for words. Then, without thinking, she asked, Why me? Sebastian turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers in the moonlight. Why not you? She opened her mouth to respond, but the words never came. Because in that moment, Sebastian reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was the first time he touched her, and just like that, something shifted. She told herself it was nothing, but it wasn't. Because that night, when he kissed her for the first time, she tasted black coffee and the beginning of something she didn't understand. She didn't know it then, but she was already falling. The apartment smelled like rain and warm vanilla, the familiar scent wrapping around Ellie as she stepped inside, shaking the water from her coat. The city had been drenched in an unexpected summer storm, and she had hurried home, clutching the tiny pregnancy test in her trembling hand, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She barely noticed the dim lighting, the faint hum of jazz playing in the background, or the glass of whiskey half-finished on the desk. All she could think about was the 2 pink lines staring up at her. Pregnant. Her lips parted, a choked laugh bubbling in her throat, half disbelief, half awe. This wasn't planned. She and Sebastian had never talked about children, never once entertained the idea of a future that stretched beyond whispered secrets and stolen moments. But now, everything had changed. She pressed a hand to her stomach, still flat, still unchanged, but suddenly holding the weight of something monumental. Could he even imagine it? The idea of holding their child, of sleepless nights and tiny fingers curled around his own? A soft smile trembled on her lips. Sebastian would be surprised, maybe a little shocked, but he'd come around. He had always told her she was the only thing that made sense in his world, and now they had something even stronger tying them together. Love, blood, a future. Her heart pounded harder as she walked toward the bedroom, excitement clawing at her chest. "Sebastian?" she called softly, stepping inside. The room was dim, the rain outside tapping against the windows, soft and rhythmic. And there he was, standing by the window, his back to her, his phone pressed against his ear. He hadn't heard her. She opened her mouth to call him again, but then, his voice low and cold. She was never meant to be permanent. Ellie froze. Her grip tightened around the pregnancy test, her stomach twisting violently. Sebastian's tone was calm, controlled, like he was discussing a business deal. "Yes, I'll take care of it. She won't be a problem for much longer." Ellie felt the ground beneath her crack open. Her mind screamed at her to move, to breathe, to do something, but she couldn't. A sickening chill crawled down her spine. Take care of it? She wasn't meant to be permanent. The man who kissed her forehead in the morning, who whispered sweet nothings into her skin at night, was planning to get rid of her. A sudden wave of nausea slammed into her, her pulse pounding in her ears so loudly that she barely heard the rest of the conversation. But then, "You don't have to worry," Sebastian continued smoothly. "She trusts me." Something inside Ellie shattered. The air left her lungs in a painful rush. Sebastian turned then, the glow of his phone illuminating his face, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met. For the first time since she had met him, she couldn't see the man she thought she knew. His face remained calm, but something flickered in his eyes, just for a second. A calculation, a decision. He ended the call, slipping the phone into his pocket. "Ellie," he murmured, stepping toward her. "What are you doing up?" She didn't speak. Couldn't. Sebastian's gaze flickered downward, to the white stick clutched in her shaking hand. He stilled. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. And then he smiled. Slow, measured. That's great news. The words were right, but the way he said them was all wrong. Ellie barely noticed the way the air shifted between them, how her skin prickled with something she didn't understand yet. Fear. Her voice trembled. "Sebastian, what were you talking about?" His smile didn't waver. "Business." She swallowed hard. "Business?" His eyes darkened just slightly. "Ellie, don't do this." She took a step back. "Don't do what?" Sebastian exhaled, as if she were exhausting him, as if her fear, her betrayal, was an inconvenience. And that was the moment she knew. There would be no explanation, no reassurance. Nothing but the truth, unspoken and undeniable. Sebastian Graves never loved her. She had been a distraction, a passing indulgence, and now she was a problem he intended to erase. Her stomach twisted, bile rising in her throat. She had to leave. Well, Ellie turned, her heartbeat thundering in her ears, but before she could reach the door, a sharp pain exploded at the back of her skull. The world tilted. Darkness swallowed her whole. She woke to the sound of the ocean, the soft lull of waves, the distant call of seagulls, the warmth of the sun pressing against her skin. For a second, she thought she was dreaming. Then the pain hit, a sharp, searing ache at the base of her skull, a throbbing pulse behind her eyes. Her limbs felt heavy, sluggish. She tried to move, only to realize that she was lying on cold, damp sand. The panic came all at once, sharp and suffocating. She pushed herself up, her fingers digging into the gritty earth beneath her, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Where was she? The last thing she remembered was the apartment. The rain. Sebastian's voice. She turned, scanning her surroundings, but there was nothing. No buildings, no roads. Just endless ocean on one side and dense, towering trees on the other. Isolation. Her stomach dropped. Sebastian had left her here. She swallowed back the rising bile in her throat, her shaking hands pressing against her belly. The baby? She closed her eyes, forcing herself to focus, to breathe. Then, there, a faint flutter beneath her palm. Still there, still fighting. Tears burned in her eyes, but she forced them down. She had survived. Sebastian had left her here, expecting her to die. But she wasn't going to. She refused to. With trembling arms, Ellie forced herself to stand, her legs weak beneath her. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, and the cold was setting in, creeping through her thin clothes like ice. She turned toward the tree line, toward the unknown. And then she started walking. Because she wasn't done yet. The forest loomed ahead, an endless stretch of darkness swallowing the last traces of daylight. Ellie staggered forward, her bare feet sinking into damp earth, her breath shallow, ragged. Every step sent a sharp jolt of pain up her legs, but she couldn't stop. Not now, not ever. Sebastian had left her here to die. But she wasn't going to. The night was cruel, pressing in on her with a suffocating chill, the wind howling through the trees like a warning. Her fingers clutched her stomach, her heartbeat thudding unevenly beneath her ribs. The baby was still there, still fighting. That was all that mattered. She had no idea where she was. No sense of direction, no supplies, no way out. The ocean had stretched behind her in an endless abyss, the shoreline offering nothing but hopelessness. The only option was forward, into the unknown. Her legs trembled as she pushed forward, branches tearing at her exposed skin, thorns slicing against her calves. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, of things unseen moving in the shadows. Her body was shutting down, exhaustion crawling through her veins like poison. Keep going. She didn't know how long she walked, time losing meaning in the silence of the wilderness. Her vision blurred, her fingers numb, her limbs screaming for rest. And then, a sound. A low, distant rumble. Ellie's pulse spiked, adrenaline forcing her body to move faster. She stumbled, half running, half crawling toward the noise, her breath hitching with every painful step. Headlights. At first, she thought she was hallucinating. But no. The light was real, cutting through the darkness like salvation. The low hum of an engine sent a shudder through the trees, distant but approaching. She tried to lift her arm, to wave, to scream, but her voice was gone, her limbs too heavy. The vehicle slowed. Tires crunched against gravel. Ellie's knees buckled. The last thing she saw was a dark figure stepping out, boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud before everything went black. Peep. The scent of wood smoke and something warm, earthy. Ellie's eyes fluttered open, her body aching, her mind sluggish. She was no longer outside. A crackling fireplace cast flickering shadows against wooden walls. The room was small, simple. A battered table pushed against the far wall, a single window covered by heavy curtains. A thick blanket covered her, rough against her skin but warm. She tried to move. Sharp pain shot up her arms. A low, steady voice cut through the haze. "You're awake." Ellie flinched. Her gaze snapped toward the source of the voice. A man stood in the corner, his arms crossed over his broad chest. His face was rough, angular, lined with faint scars. He had the look of someone who had seen war and survived it. His name surfaced in her hazy mind. Graham. She tried to speak, her throat dry. Graham moved closer, placing a steaming mug on the table beside her. "Drink," he said simply. Ellie hesitated, her muscles tensed, but the scent of something warm and familiar made her stomach clench with hunger. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she brought the mug to her lips. Tea. She barely tasted it, but the warmth spread through her, grounding her back into reality. "Where?" Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "Middle of nowhere," Graham said. "Found you on the old dirt road a few miles from here. Thought you were dead at first." Ellie swallowed hard. Maybe she should have been. The thought crawled into her mind before she could stop it. She had nothing, no home, no future, no way to fight a man as powerful as Sebastian. But then, a flutter beneath her palm. "The baby?" Ellie's jaw tightened. No, she wasn't done. Graham studied her in silence, his sharp gaze lingering on her hollow cheeks, the bruises along her arms, the way she clutched her stomach like it was the only thing anchoring her to this world. "You don't have to tell me what happened," he said finally. "But if someone did this to you, you should tell someone. The police, maybe." A hollow laugh slipped from her lips. "The police?" As if the law would do anything against Sebastian Graves. As if the world even knew the kind of monster he was. She turned her head away, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. Graham sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Right. Thought so." Silence stretched between them. Then, "I need to get back." Graham's frown deepened. "Back where?" Ellie lifted her gaze, steel settling into her bones. "To the man who left me to die." Graham's eyes darkened. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her, assessing. "You want revenge?" Ellie exhaled slowly. "I want justice." A beat of silence. Then, to her surprise, a slow smirk tugged at the corner of Graham's lips. "Good." He reached for his coat, tossing it over the back of a chair. "Then let's get to work." Ellie stood in front of the mirror, staring at her own reflection. The woman who gazed back at her was no longer the same person who had once believed in love, in whispered promises and soft touches that meant forever. That woman had died the night Sebastian left her to rot. Now she was something else. Someone else. She pressed a palm to her stomach, the slight swell beneath her fingertips grounding her, reminding her why she couldn't afford to break. She had already been broken, already been abandoned, already learned what it felt like to be powerless. Never again. Graham's voice cut through the silence behind her. "You hesitated today." Ellie turned, jaw tightening. He was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed over his broad chest, his sharp eyes unreadable. "I didn't," she countered. Graham stepped forward, slow, deliberate. "You did. You pulled your punches." Ellie exhaled, fingers curling into fists. She could still feel the sting in her knuckles, the burn in her muscles from the training session that had left her breathless and sore. Graham had been relentless, and she needed him to be. "I'm not used to this," she admitted, rolling her shoulders, the dull ache settling deep into her bones. Graham studied her for a long moment. "You weren't meant to be." The words should have stung, but they didn't. He wasn't insulting her. He was stating a fact. "I spent years learning how to fight," he continued, "how to survive. You spent years learning how to trust the wrong people." Ellie flinched, but didn't look away. Do you want revenge? Or do you want to walk into that wedding and give him another chance to destroy you? Ellie's stomach twisted. Graham had a way of cutting straight through the layers, of seeing things she wasn't ready to admit. But she was done lying to herself. I want to ruin him, she said, voice steady. I want him to feel everything I felt. I want him to know what it's like to have his world ripped out from under him. Graham nodded, something approving in his gaze. Then stop hesitating. Ellie clenched her fists. She was trying. Every day was a battle, rebuilding herself, sharpening the edges Sebastian had dulled. Graham had been training her for weeks now, pushing her to her limits, forcing her to fight, to move, to strike without mercy. It wasn't enough to confront Sebastian. She needed to be ready. Because Sebastian Graves was a man who controlled everything. And she would make him lose it all. The sun burned low in the sky as Ellie crouched behind the shooting range, her breath steadying. Again, Graham ordered. Her arms shook as she raised the gun, her fingers wrapping around the cold metal. She exhaled, lined up the shot, and pulled the trigger. The bullet slammed into the target, just left of center. Sloppy. Ellie scowled. It was close. Close doesn't win fights, Graham muttered. Close doesn't save lives. Ellie grit her teeth, adjusting her stance. The weight of the gun was still unfamiliar, but she was learning. She had to. Again, she fired. Again and again. Until her hands were raw, until the ache in her muscles turned into something numb. Until Graham's voice finally rumbled with approval. Better. Ellie lowered the gun, exhaling sharply. Her heart was still racing, but she didn't hate the feeling. The old version of her would have never touched a weapon, never imagined a world where she needed to fight to survive. But this world was different. This world had no place for the naive girl who had once believed in love. At night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling of Graham's cabin. The wind howled outside, rattling the wooden walls, but she barely heard it. Her mind was stuck in the past. Sebastian's voice, smooth and controlled. She was never meant to be permanent. The words played on a loop, a cruel whisper in the back of her mind. She turned, pressing a hand to her stomach. The baby kicked, a soft reminder that she wasn't alone. Not anymore. She wouldn't let Sebastian win. She wouldn't let him rewrite her story. Ellie exhaled slowly, closing her eyes. Tomorrow she would be stronger. Tomorrow she would be closer to the woman she needed to become. And when the time came, she would walk into his perfect wedding and burn his world to the ground. The grand hall shimmered under the glow of extravagant chandeliers, their golden light casting a warm haze over the sea of high-profile guests. The scent of roses and expensive perfume hung in the air, mingling with the quiet hum of conversation and the soft strains of a string quartet. Every detail had been meticulously curated. The towering floral arrangements, the flickering candlelight, the polished silverware gleaming under the soft glow of the ceiling fixtures. This was a wedding meant to be remembered, and Eleanor Carter was about to ensure that it was. She stood outside the towering doors, her pulse a steady, unyielding rhythm against her ribs. The silk of her dress clung to her frame, the deep emerald fabric carefully chosen, not to blend in, but to stand out. She wanted him to see her. She wanted him to feel her presence like a blade pressed against his throat. Inside, Sebastian Graves stood at the altar, his fingers lightly resting on Lillian Vaughn's waist. His jaw was tight, his expression carefully controlled as he listened to the officiant recite words that were supposed to bind him to his new bride forever. The world thought this was the beginning of a perfect love story, but Ellie knew the truth. She had lived it. He had whispered the same promises to her once, had kissed her with the same calculated affection, had made her believe in a future that never existed. And when he was done with her, when she had outlived her usefulness, he had discarded her like an inconvenience. But she hadn't died. And now she was here. Ellie tightened her grip on the folded documents in her hand, her breath steadying. She wasn't here to beg for answers, wasn't here to plead for the scraps of an apology. She was here to end him. She pressed a palm to the heavy doors and shoved them open. The hall fell into silence. The music stopped. Every head in the room turned. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, murmurs breaking the stillness like the first crack of thunder before a storm. At the altar, Sebastian went rigid. His grip on Lillian's waist tightened as he slowly turned, his entire body locking up the second his eyes met hers. Ellie stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, each step precise, deliberate. She kept her chin high, her expression unreadable, despite the way fury burned in her veins. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Is she pregnant?" Lillian's confusion twisted into something sharp, something uneasy. "Sebastian?" But Sebastian couldn't move. He had planned for everything, controlled every variable, except for this. Ellie took another step forward, the distance between them shrinking with every breath. Then, without hesitation, she lifted her hand and slapped him across the face. The sound cracked through the air like lightning. Gasps erupted. A champagne flute slipped from someone's fingers, shattering against the floor. Sebastian's head snapped to the side, his jaw tightening as the sharp red imprint of her palm bloomed across his cheek. He staggered slightly, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts, his carefully composed mask fracturing right in front of everyone. Ellie let the silence stretch, let the weight of her presence settle over the room like an unshakable force. Then she smiled, sharp, dangerous. "Miss me, darlin'?" Lillian took a step back, her face pale, her hands trembling at her sides. "Someone want to tell me what the hell is going on?" she demanded, her voice high and clipped, barely masking the betrayal lacing every syllable. Ellie tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh, did he not tell you?" Lillian turned to Sebastian, her blue eyes flashing with suspicion. "Tell me what?" Sebastian swallowed, his throat working as he struggled to piece together a response. But before he could spin another lie, Ellie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a stack of papers. Then, with the same steady precision, she flung them onto the altar. Medical reports, witness statements, a DNA test, the truth. They scattered across the polished floor, slipping beneath the guests' feet, the bold black ink damning and irrefutable. Ellie turned back to Sebastian, voice steady. "Tell them where I was for the past 3 months." Silence. The weight of it was suffocating. Sebastian clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. "Ellie," he started, his voice dangerously low. "This isn't the time." "Oh, I think it's exactly the time." The crowd shifted, curiosity and shock mingling in the air. Lillian bent down, snatching one of the papers from the floor. As her eyes scanned the words, her breath hitched. This is real?" she whispered. Ellie crossed her arms. "I have the scars to prove it." Lillian's hands shook. "You told me she was dead." Sebastian flinched, his carefully composed facade cracking. Lillian. But Lillian's expression twisted into something lethal, something disgusted. You married her? Sebastian reached for her, but she recoiled. Ellie's smile didn't falter. Oh, he didn't just marry me, she said smoothly. He tried to kill me. A gasp swept through the room. Sebastian's breath left him in a sharp exhale. You're insane, he snapped, his voice tight with desperation. You have no proof. Ellie took a step closer, her voice barely above a whisper. I remember everything you said before you drugged me. Sebastian stilled. The color drained from his face. For the first time, real fear flickered in his gaze. And Ellie relished it. Lillian's face twisted with revulsion as she ripped the diamond ring from her finger. We're done. She flung it at his chest. The moment it hit the floor, everything unraveled. Business partners in the crowd exchanged sharp glances. Some pulled out their phones, typing urgent messages. Investors whispered amongst themselves, their expressions turning cold. From the front row, an older woman slowly stood. Sebastian's mother. Her face was unreadable, but her voice carried through the hall like the final nail in his coffin. You are no son of mine. Sebastian's lips parted, raw panic flashing in his eyes. Mother, please. But she turned, walking away without another word. Security stepped forward. The venue manager, once eager to cater to his every whim, now stared at him with disdain. Mr. Graves, he said, his voice clipped, we're going to have to ask you to leave. Sebastian's chest rose and fell rapidly. His hands shook at his sides, his entire world crumbling around him in real time. And Ellie? She simply stood there, watching. Not with satisfaction, not with joy, just with quiet, unwavering strength. Sebastian did the only thing left he could do. He turned and fled. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that stretched, heavy and suffocating, pressing into the bones of every person seated in the grand chamber. The air felt thick, dense with anticipation. The kind that came before something irrevocable, something final. Ellie sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting gently on the swell of her belly. The weight of everything pressed down on her. Months of pain, betrayal, survival, but she didn't let it show. She had spent too long being powerless. That part of her life was over. Across from her, Sebastian Graves sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if his teeth might crack. He had traded his perfectly tailored tuxedo for an expensive gray suit, but the fabric did nothing to hide the storm brewing beneath his carefully composed mask. He was losing, and for the first time in his privileged, carefully constructed life, he couldn't do a damn thing about it. The judge, an older man with sharp, calculating eyes, cleared his throat as he set down the last of the legal documents before him. The court has reviewed all presented evidence, he began, his voice steady, measured. The medical records, the witness testimonies, the financial transactions detailing the transfer of funds used to orchestrate Miss Carter's disappearance. Sebastian didn't move, but his hands curled into fists beneath the table. Ellie didn't take her eyes off him. She wanted him to feel every second of this. Furthermore, the judge continued, the DNA results confirming the unborn child's paternity, combined with the statements from multiple witnesses, provide undeniable proof of the defendant's intent to sever all ties with the plaintiff through deliberate and malicious means. Sebastian finally spoke, his voice low, dangerously controlled, This is ridiculous." The judge barely acknowledged him. "The evidence is overwhelming, Mr. Graves." Sebastian's lawyer, a man who had once walked into this courtroom with an air of untouchable confidence, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had known this was a losing battle from the moment Ellie had walked into that wedding and burned Sebastian's world to the ground. "The court finds in favor of Miss Eleanor Carter." A murmur swept through the room. Sebastian exhaled sharply through his nose, his nostrils flaring. Ellie's grip tightened on her lap. She had won. Not just the case, not just the financial settlement that would ensure she and her child would never struggle. She had won everything he had taken from her. Sebastian straightened, his shoulders still squared, his face impassive, but Ellie saw it. The cracks in his foundation, the thin unraveling thread of his control. She could feel his rage pulsing beneath the surface, his entire body coiled tight like a predator realizing too late that he had become the hunted. "The defendant," the judge continued, his voice carrying across the chamber, "will also be required to relinquish any and all claims to the plaintiff's child, ensuring that Miss Carter retains sole legal custody." Sebastian snapped. His chair scraped violently against the floor as he pushed to his feet. "That is my child," he growled, his voice sharp enough to slice through the air. Ellie remained seated, unshaken. For the first time, he was the one losing control. The bailiff stepped forward, muscles tensed, but the judge simply raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Graves." Sebastian's chest rose and fell sharply, his fists clenching at his sides. But he had no power here. Not anymore. Slowly, he lowered himself back into his chair. The judge turned to Ellie, his expression softer. "Miss Carter, do you have any final remarks?" Ellie could feel every gaze in the room pinned to her, waiting, expecting. She inhaled slowly, pressing a palm to her stomach, feeling the faint, reassuring flutter beneath her fingers. Then she lifted her gaze and met Sebastian's eyes, and smiled, not in triumph, not in cruelty, but in freedom. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "I've said everything I needed to." The gavel struck wood, and it was done. Sebastian's empire had already begun to crumble the night she exposed him. But here, in this courtroom, she buried it. He would have nothing. No power, no legacy. Not even the right to whisper his name to their child. Ellie stood, smoothing her dress as she turned. She never looked back. The sun was warm against her skin as she stepped outside the courthouse. The wind carried the weight of her past away, letting it scatter like dust in the streets. Mike was waiting for her, leaning against his truck, arms crossed, his usual unreadable expression in place. "You did it," he said simply as she approached. Ellie exhaled slowly, pressing a hand over her stomach. "We did it," she corrected. Mike didn't argue. He never did. He just opened the truck door for her, waiting as she climbed inside. Ellie settled against the seat, the exhaustion creeping in now that the battle was over. For the first time in months, she felt something unfamiliar. Peace. And for the first time in her life, she was free. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and earth as Ellie stood on the balcony of her new home, cradling the tiny bundle in her arms. The baby stirred, letting out a soft sound, barely more than a sigh, before settling back into sleep. Ellie traced a fingertip over the delicate curve of her daughter's cheek, her heart swelling in a way she never thought possible. "We made it," she whispered. The words felt heavier than they should, carrying the weight of every battle she had fought to get here. It hadn't been easy. Freedom never was. After the trial, she had taken the money from the settlement, not as revenge, not as compensation, but as a foundation, a new beginning. She hadn't spent it on luxury, hadn't drowned herself in material things the way Sebastian would have. Instead, she built something real. The Eleanor Carter Foundation was already making waves, a refuge for women like her, for the ones who had been discarded, manipulated, used. Women who had been left behind and needed to fight their way back. She had turned her pain into something powerful, and for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. Ellie ran her fingers through her daughter's soft curls, pressing a gentle kiss to her tiny forehead. "You'll never have to know that kind of pain," she murmured. "Not while I'm still breathing." A deep voice cut through the quiet. "You say that like she's listening." Ellie turned, a small smile tugging at her lips. Mike stood leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. His ever-present, unreadable expression softened just slightly. "She's always listening," Ellie said, rocking the baby gently. "I want her to know she's safe." Mike stepped onto the balcony, the wooden boards creaking beneath his weight. "She will be. She's got you." Ellie's gaze dropped for a second, focusing on the rise and fall of her daughter's tiny chest. "Yeah," she said quietly. "She does." For a long time, she had been alone. She had fought, survived, rebuilt herself, with nothing but sheer will and the fire of knowing she had been left for dead. But now, she wasn't alone. Mike had been there through it all. Through the long nights when sleep refused to come. Through the days when the world felt too heavy. When the memories of what Sebastian had done threatened to pull her under. Through the moments when she thought she might break. He had never asked for anything in return. Had never pushed her. Had never tried to claim her the way Sebastian had. And maybe that was why she let herself breathe around him. "You ever gonna let yourself rest?" Mike asked, his tone light but edged with something else. Ellie exhaled slowly. "Eventually." Mike studied her for a moment before nodding. He didn't push. He never did. "You hungry?" he asked instead. "I made dinner." Ellie lifted a brow. "You mean you heated something up?" Mike smirked. "Same thing." Ellie let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "I'll be inside in a minute." Mike hesitated before nodding. "Take your time." And then, just like that, he was gone. Ellie turned back to the night sky, her arms tightening around her daughter. A year ago, she had thought her life was over, that she was nothing more than a forgotten name in Sebastian's past, that he had won. But now, he was nothing. She never thought about him. Not anymore, because she had everything that mattered. She closed her eyes, exhaling deeply. She had survived. She had won. And for the first time in her life, she was free. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. It means more than you know. If there's one lesson to take from Ellie's journey, it's this. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing back up, even when the world tries to break you. Betrayal, loss, and pain may shake us, but they don't define us. What defines us is what we do next. Ellie wasn't just a survivor. She reclaimed her power, turned her pain into something meaningful, and built a future on her own terms. And that's something we can all learn from. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I love hearing from you. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another video. More stories of resilience, justice, and empowerment are on the way, and I promise, You won't want to miss them. Until next time, stay strong, stay fearless, and always remember, you are more powerful than the people who tried to break you. See you in the next video.